Chapter 1. A Boy from Gori. In a small Georgian town called Gori, a baby was born. His name was Yoseb Bessarionis Dze Jugashvili. But one day, the world would know him as Joseph Stalin. He was born on December 18th, 1878, to a poor family. His father, Bessarion, was a shoemaker. His mother, Ketevan, was a washerwoman. Life was not easy for them. Gori was a quiet place, surrounded by mountains and green fields. The people of Georgia were proud of their traditions. They sang songs, told stories, and loved their homeland. But for little Ioseb, life was not always full of joy. His father drank too much and often became angry. Sometimes he hit young Ioseb and his mother. It was a hard and painful childhood. But Ketevan loved her son deeply. She believed he could have a better life. She dreamed of him becoming a priest. It was a dream filled with hope. She worked tirelessly, washing clothes for other families to earn money. She saved every coin to send Ioseb to school. When Ioseb was 6 years old, tragedy struck. He became very sick. Smallpox, a deadly disease, covered his face with painful marks. He survived, but the scars stayed with him forever. Children teased him. They called him names like pockmarked. It made Ioseb feel angry and lonely. But he didn't give up. He wanted to prove he was strong. At school, Yoseb showed that he was more than just a poor shoemaker's son. He was smart, very smart. He loved to read and write. Books opened new worlds for him. He especially loved stories of heroes who fought for justice. These stories gave him hope. They made him dream of something bigger. One of his teachers noticed Ioseb's talent. He taught the young boy about poetry, and soon Ioseb began to write his own poems. His words were beautiful, full of emotion and love for Georgia. Some of his poems were even published in local newspapers. Imagine that! A poor boy from Gori becoming a poet. For a moment, it seemed like a brighter future was possible. But life wasn't just books and poetry. Gori could be a dangerous place. Fights often broke out in the streets. Ioseb had to learn how to defend himself. He became tough, stronger than other boys. People started to respect him and fear him. Still, his mother believed in education. She sent him to a religious school in Gori. The school was strict, but Ioseb did well. He impressed his teachers with his intelligence. They thought he might one day become a priest. His mother was proud. Finally, it seemed like her hard work was paying off. But Yoseb had other ideas. By the time he was a teenager, he began to question the world around him. Why were some people rich while others were poor? Why did his father have to struggle so much? These questions filled his mind. He started to think that maybe the system was unfair. Maybe it needed to change. In 1894, Yoseb won a scholarship to a seminary in Tiflis, now Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. It was a big moment. For the first time, he left his small town. Tiflis was a busy, modern city. There were cars, factories, and people from all over the world. It was exciting, but also overwhelming. At the seminary, life was strict. Students had to wake up early, pray, and follow many rules. The priests controlled everything. But Ioseb didn't like being told what to do. He began to rebel. He read books that were banned by the seminary, books about revolution and freedom. He secretly shared these ideas with other students. He was no longer the quiet boy from Gori. He was becoming a leader. The seminary noticed his behavior. They punished him many times. But Ioseb didn't stop. He became more determined. He started reading the works of Karl Marx, the famous revolutionary thinker. Marx's ideas inspired him. They spoke of a world without rich and poor, where everyone was equal. It was a new kind of dream, and Ioseb believed in it. In 1899, everything changed. Ioseb left the seminary. Some say he was expelled. Others believe he chose to leave. Either way, his path was now clear. He would not become a priest. Instead, he would become a revolutionary. Back in Gori, people began to see Ioseb differently. He was no longer just a shoemaker's son or a scarred boy from the streets. He was a man with ideas, big ideas. But the road ahead would not be easy. Revolution was dangerous. It meant breaking the law, hiding from the police, and risking everything. As Ioseb left Gori for the bigger world, he carried with him the lessons of his childhood, the pain, the poverty, and the dreams of a better life. He would use these lessons to rise, and one day change the course of history. But for now, he was just a boy from Gori, a boy with scars, both on his face and in his heart, a boy who refused to give up, and a boy who dared to dream. Chapter 2. The Poet and the Rebel. Did you know that Joseph Stalin once wrote poetry? It's true. Before he became a revolutionary, young Ioseb Jugashvili dreamed of words, not war. His poems were delicate and full of feeling. They spoke of nature, love, and the Georgian spirit. But life had other plans for him. And soon, poetry wasn't enough. When Ioseb was a teenager, he attended the seminary in Tiflis. It was a strict school where boys trained to become priests. The days were long and full of rules. Wake up early, pray, study, obey. For many boys, this life was peaceful. But for Ioseb, it felt like a cage. At first, Ioseb followed the rules. He was a good student. His teachers admired his intelligence and discipline. But there was another side to him. Deep down, Ioseb loved freedom. He found escape in books. Not just any books. Secret ones. These books were banned by the seminary. They were full of new and dangerous ideas. One day, a classmate shared a copy of a poem by Shota Rustaveli, a famous Georgian poet. The words lit a fire in Ioseb's heart. Rustaveli wrote about courage, honor, and the fight for justice. Inspired, Ioseb began to write his own poetry. His words were beautiful, even haunting. They were published in local Georgian newspapers. People loved them. Readers didn't know the poet's name. He signed his work as Sosolo. But behind the pen name was a quiet young man dreaming of a brighter world. Here's one of his poems. Morning rays shine on the peaks, lighting up our native land. May freedom rise with the sun. A gift for every man. His mother, Ketevan, was proud. She told her neighbors, "My son will do great things." But Ioseb's father, Bessarion, was not impressed. He wanted his son to be strong, not soft like a poet. By this time, Bessarion had left the family, and Ioseb rarely saw him. This made the boy angry. He carried this anger with him, anger at his father, at poverty, and at a world that seemed so unfair. As Ioseb grew older, the seminary began to feel smaller. He wanted answers to big questions. Why were so many people poor? Why did the rich have all the power? And why wasn't anyone doing anything about it? These questions wouldn't leave his mind. One day, a fellow student gave Ioseb a new book. It was by Karl Marx, a German philosopher. Marx wrote about revolution. He dreamed of a world where workers, not kings or czars, had the power. His ideas shocked Ioseb. They were bold, dangerous, and exciting. Ioseb began to believe that Marx was right. The system was broken, and it needed to change. The seminary's priest noticed a change in Ioseb. He became quieter during lessons, but more active in secret. He started talking to other students about Marx. He shared banned books. He told his friends that revolution was the only answer. Some listened. Others were scared. They warned him, "Be careful. The police will come for you." But Ioseb didn't stop. He was no longer just a poet. He was becoming a rebel. In 1899, everything came to a breaking point. The seminary accused Ioseb of spreading dangerous ideas. He was caught with banned books and forbidden newspapers. The priests gave him a choice: stop rebelling or leave the seminary. Ioseb chose to leave. When he walked out of the seminary gates, he felt free, but also scared. For the first time, he was on his own. No school, no money, no clear plan. What would he do now? At first, Ioseb returned to his poetry. It gave him comfort. But poetry couldn't solve his problems. The world around him was full of injustice. Workers labored for hours in factories for little pay. Farmers struggled to feed their families. And the Tsar, the ruler of Russia, seemed to do nothing. Ioseb felt anger growing inside him. In Tiflis, he found others who felt the same. These were men and women who called themselves revolutionaries. They wanted to overthrow the Tsar. They talked about strikes, protests, and even violence. Ioseb listened carefully. This was what he had been searching for: a cause, a purpose. Soon, he joined their movement. The revolutionaries saw something special in Ioseb. He was smart, calm, and determined. They trusted him with important tasks. He delivered secret messages, organized meetings, and recruited new members. He learned how to hide from the police and how to speak in code. Slowly, he became a leader. But being a revolutionary was dangerous. The police were everywhere. They arrested anyone they suspected of rebellion. If caught, Ioseb could be sent to prison. Or worse, he had to be careful, but he was willing to take the risk. He believed the fight for justice was worth it. In the years that followed, Ioseb's life changed completely. He left behind the boy who wrote poetry and became a man ready to fight. He gave up his dreams of becoming a priest. He gave up his safe life in Tiflis. And he gave up his pen name, Sosolo. From this moment on, Ioseb would be known as Stalin, a name that would soon strike fear and awe around the world. But before he could rise to power, Stalin had many battles to fight. He was just beginning his journey. The rebel from Georgia was ready to take on the Tsar's empire, one step at a time. Chapter 3. The Underground Revolutionary. The year was 1901, and Ioseb Yugashvili, now calling himself Stalin, had joined a secret world. It was the world of revolutionaries, a dangerous place where whispers could get you arrested, and a single mistake could cost your life. In Tiflis, Stalin worked with a group called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. They were fighting to overthrow the Tsar, the powerful ruler of Russia. The Tsar controlled everything: laws, armies, and even people's lives. But Stalin and his comrades believed this was wrong. They wanted equality. They wanted power for the workers. This was not an easy dream. The Tsar's police were everywhere. They watched, they listened, and they arrested anyone who seemed suspicious. Revolutionaries had to be clever. They used fake names and secret signals. They met in hidden places, dark basements, quiet forests, or small back rooms in shops. Every meeting was risky. If the police found them, it would mean prison, or worse. Stalin quickly proved himself to be fearless. He organized strikes in factories where workers stopped working to demand better pay and conditions. At one factory, Stalin gave a fiery speech. He told the workers they deserved more. They cheered. But as Stalin left, he saw police officers waiting in the shadows. He barely escaped that night. His heart raced as he hid in the dark streets of Tiflis. This was Stalin's new life. Always on the run, always looking over his shoulder. But he didn't stop. He believed in the cause too much. One of Stalin's most dangerous jobs was printing revolutionary leaflets. The leaflets called for workers to rise up and fight against the Tsar. Stalin worked late at night, carefully printing each page by hand. The room smelled of ink, and his hands were black with stains. He knew that if the police found the printing press, they would arrest him. But Stalin didn't care. He wanted people to hear the message. In 1902, the danger caught up with him. The police raided a secret meeting, and Stalin was arrested. They dragged him to a cold, damp prison cell. It was a small room with no windows. Stalin spent months there, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. But even in prison, he didn't lose hope. He talked to other prisoners, learning from them, sharing ideas. He was already thinking about what he would do when he got out. After 8 months, Stalin was sent to Siberia. Siberia was far, far away, a frozen land where the government sent prisoners to keep them from causing trouble. The journey was long and miserable. Stalin was packed into a crowded train surrounded by guards. The cold air bit his skin. But even in Siberia, Stalin found ways to resist. He escaped. Using his wits and determination, he found his way back to Tiflis. Stalin's escape made him a hero among the revolutionaries. They saw him as strong and brave, someone they could trust. Soon, Stalin was given more important missions. He traveled across the Caucasus, organizing workers and spreading revolutionary ideas. He visited cities like Batumi and Baku, where oil workers toiled under terrible conditions. Stalin inspired these workers to strike, to fight back. Many of them joined the cause because of his words. But the life of a revolutionary was not all excitement and heroism. It was also lonely. Stalin rarely saw his family. He had to move constantly, staying ahead of the police. He used fake names, sometimes calling himself Koba, a name from Georgian folklore that meant a brave and cunning hero. But no matter what name he used, he was always the same man, determined, relentless, and driven by his dream of revolution. The revolutionaries were not united. There were arguments and divisions within the movement. Some believed in peaceful protests. Others believed violence was the only answer. Stalin aligned himself with the Bolsheviks, a group led by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks wanted immediate, radical change. They believed that revolution couldn't wait. Stalin admired Lenin's leadership and began working closely with him. Stalin's work became even more dangerous. He helped organize robberies to fund the Bolsheviks' activities. One of the most famous robberies happened in 1907 in the city of Tiflis. Stalin and his group planned to steal money from a bank. It was a daring plan, and it worked. They escaped with a huge sum of money, but many people were hurt in the process. This robbery made Stalin infamous. The Tsar's police now considered him one of the most wanted men in the empire. By now, Stalin was no longer just a small-town revolutionary. He was becoming a key figure in the Bolshevik movement. He attended secret meetings across Russia and even traveled to other countries to meet with exiled revolutionaries. In Finland, he met Lenin face to face. Lenin saw Stalin's potential and began to rely on him more and more. But Stalin's growing importance also made him a bigger target. In 1910, he was arrested again. Once more, he was sent to Siberia. This time, the journey was even harsher. The guards treated the prisoners like animals. The freezing temperatures cut through their thin clothes. Many prisoners fell sick, but Stalin survived. In Siberia, Stalin's days were long and empty. He spent hours thinking about the revolution, about Lenin, and about the future. Would they ever succeed? Would the workers ever rise up? These questions haunted him, but they also motivated him. He knew that every moment in Siberia was preparing him for the battles ahead. In 1911, Stalin escaped again. This time, his escape was more difficult. He had to walk for days through snow-covered forests, hiding from patrols. But he made it. Once free, he returned to his work with even more determination. By now, Stalin was no longer the young poet who once wrote about morning rays and freedom. he had become something else. He was hardened, unshaken by fear, and willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. The Tsar's empire was starting to crack. Protests were growing louder. Strikes were becoming more frequent. The revolutionaries felt that change was coming, and Stalin was right in the middle of it all, ready for the next chapter of his life. He had survived prison. He had escaped Siberia. He had risked his life again and again. But the fight was far from over. Stalin knew that the road ahead would be even more dangerous, but he also believed it would lead to victory. Chapter 4. From Siberia with fury. It was cold, bitterly cold. The wind howled through the trees, and snow covered everything in sight. This was Siberia, the Tsar's faraway land of exile. It was a place for prisoners, men and women who dared to challenge the empire. Among them was a young revolutionary named Stalin. In 1910, Stalin had been arrested again. This time, the Tsar's police were determined to send him far away. The journey to Siberia was long and cruel. Packed into crowded trains, the prisoners were treated like animals. They were given little food, and the icy air seeped through the walls of the train cars. Many grew sick. Some died. But Stalin survived. When Stalin arrived in Siberia, he saw nothing but snow and ice. The ground was frozen. The rivers were silent, locked under thick sheets of ice. The small wooden houses in the village were covered in frost. It was a place of isolation, far from the cities and the revolution he loved. For most men, this would have been the end. But for Stalin, it was just another test. The days in Siberia were long and empty. Stalin woke each morning to the sound of the cold wind. There was little to do. He spent his time chopping firewood, hunting for food, and walking through the snow. It was a lonely existence. But Stalin refused to let it break him. Instead, he used the time to think. He thought about his dreams of revolution. He thought about Karl Marx and Lenin and the fight for workers' rights. And he thought about his own future. Would he spend the rest of his life in exile? Or would he find a way to return to the fight? Despite the isolation, Stalin found ways to connect with the outside world. He wrote letters to his comrades. He asked for news of strikes and protests. The revolution was growing stronger even without him. This gave him hope. It reminded him that he was not alone. Stalin also found comfort in books. He read every book he could get his hands on. History, politics, philosophy, he devoured them all. He believed that knowledge was power. The more he read, the more he understood the world and how to change it. He kept a small notebook where he wrote down his thoughts and ideas. Even in exile, Stalin was planning for the future. But Siberia was not just cold and lonely. It was dangerous. The exiles were watched by guards who reported everything they said or did. One wrong word could lead to harsher punishment. Stalin knew he had to be careful. He kept his revolutionary spirit hidden, pretending to be an ordinary prisoner. But inside, his anger burned. He was angry at the Tsar, who ruled over millions with no mercy. He was angry at the police, who hunted down anyone who dared to think differently. And he was angry at the system that kept people like him poor and powerless. This anger gave him strength. It pushed him to keep going, even when the days felt endless. Stalin's time in Siberia also hardened him. He became tougher, colder, and more determined. He learned how to survive in the harshest conditions. He hunted wolves and rabbits for food. He built fires to keep warm. He walked for hours in the snow, his boots sinking into the frozen ground. Each step was a reminder that he would not give up. But exile wasn't forever. Stalin had a gift, a clever mind, and a talent for escaping. In 1911, he saw his chance. He planned carefully, studying the guards' routines and waiting for the perfect moment. Then, one night, he slipped away into the snowy wilderness. Escape from Siberia was not easy. The nearest town was hundreds of miles away, and Stalin had no map, no money, and little food. But he had determination. He walked through freezing forests, crossing rivers, and hiding from patrols. The cold cut through his clothes, and hunger gnawed at his stomach. But he kept going. After days of walking, Stalin reached a small village. He begged for food and shelter, telling the villagers he was lost. They gave him bread and warm clothes. Slowly, he made his way back to the cities where the revolution was alive. He had survived Siberia, and now he was ready to fight again. When Stalin returned, he found a movement on the brink of change. The Tsar's empire was weakening. Workers were striking, peasants were rebelling, and the Bolsheviks were growing stronger. Stalin's comrades welcomed him back. They knew he was tough and loyal, someone they could count on. But Stalin was different now. The cold of Siberia had left its mark on him. He was more determined, but also harder and more ruthless. He had no patience for weakness. He believed that the fight for revolution required strength. Strength of mind, strength of will, and strength to do whatever it took. Lenin noticed Stalin's growth. He began to trust him with more important tasks. Stalin traveled across Russia, organizing strikes and spreading revolutionary ideas. He was careful to avoid the police, using fake names and disguises. Each mission brought new risks, but Stalin didn't hesitate. He had already faced the worst in Siberia. Nothing could scare him now. Looking back, Siberia was a turning point in Stalin's life. It was a place of suffering, but also a place of transformation. It had tested him and prepared him for the battles ahead. He had faced the cold, the hunger, and the loneliness. And he had won. Stalin's journey from Siberia was not just a physical escape. It was the beginning of his rise. The young man who had once written poetry and dreamed of justice was now a hardened revolutionary. The Tsar's empire would soon feel the full force of his fury. As Stalin returned to the revolution, he carried with him the lessons of Siberia. He knew that survival required strength, strategy, and an unshakable belief in the cause. The path ahead would be dangerous, but Stalin was ready. He had faced the worst. And he would face it again if it meant victory. Chapter 5. The Rise of the Steel Man. In the early 1900s, Iosif Ugashvili was a name whispered in secret, a name known only to a few revolutionaries, but soon he would take a new name, Stalin, the Man of Steel. This name would come to symbolize power, strength, and unshakable determination. Why Stalin? The name reflected his nature. Steel is hard, unbreakable, and strong. Stalin wanted to be seen the same way. He was no longer just a man. He was becoming an idea, a symbol of the fight for revolution. After escaping from Siberia, Stalin returned to his revolutionary work. Russia was in turmoil. Strikes and protests were spreading across the empire. Workers demanded better pay, farmers wanted more land, and the people wanted freedom from the Tsar's rule. The Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, promised change. Stalin believed in Lenin's vision. Together, they dreamed of a new Russia, one ruled by workers, not kings. But Stalin wasn't famous like Lenin. Not yet. He was a man working in the shadows, doing the dangerous jobs that others avoided. He organized strikes in factories, risking arrest every day. He helped print illegal newspapers, spreading the Bolshevik message to workers and peasants. He even planned robberies to fund the revolution. One daring heist in Tiflis made headlines across Russia. Stalin's group stole a fortune from a bank, escaping under a hail of gunfire. The Tsar's police called him a criminal. The Bolsheviks called him a hero. Despite his bravery, Stalin wasn't loved by everyone. Some of his comrades thought he was too rough, too controlling. But Lenin saw something different. Lenin admired Stalin's toughness. He trusted Stalin to do the hard, dirty work that kept the revolution alive. Slowly, Stalin climbed higher in the ranks of the party. One of Stalin's most important tasks was in Baku, a city rich with oil fields. The workers there lived in terrible conditions. They worked long hours for low pay, and their homes were small and dirty. Stalin arrived in Baku with a mission: to organize these workers and turn their anger into action. He succeeded. Under Stalin's leadership, workers in Baku went on strike. They stopped the oil factories, costing the rich owners thousands of rubles. The police tried to stop the strikes, but Stalin was always one step ahead. He moved secretly, changing his location every night. He spoke to the workers in their language, winning their trust. He wasn't just a leader. He was one of them. But Stalin's rise wasn't just about bravery. It was also about strategy. He knew how to outthink his enemies. He understood people, their fears, their hopes, and their weaknesses. He used this knowledge to win power, step by step. In 1912, Lenin gave Stalin a new responsibility. He made Stalin the editor of Pravda, the Bolshevik Party's main newspaper. This was a big job. Pravda wasn't just a newspaper. It was the voice of the revolution. Stalin used it to spread Bolshevik ideas across Russia. Through Pravda, he reached workers, farmers, and soldiers. He wrote about injustice, poverty, and the need for change. His words inspired many, but they also angered the Tsar's government. Stalin's work as an editor brought him closer to Lenin. He attended secret meetings with other Bolshevik leaders. These meetings were dangerous, held in hidden locations with lookouts watching for the police. Lenin noticed Stalin's ability to stay calm under pressure. He saw Stalin's determination and loyalty. Over time, Lenin began to trust Stalin more than others in the party. But Stalin's rise wasn't without sacrifice. He spent years living as a fugitive, moving from city to city. He couldn't see his family, and he had no home. The Tsar's police were always hunting him. They arrested him multiple times, sending him back to Siberia. But each time, Stalin found a way to escape. Each escape made him stronger, more determined to keep fighting. In 1917, everything changed. Russia erupted into revolution. The people rose up against the Tsar, demanding his abdication. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, was over. A new government was formed, but it was weak and chaotic. The Bolsheviks saw their chance. Lenin returned to Russia, ready to lead the final push for power. And Stalin was right by his side. During this time, Stalin's role became even more important. He organized protests, managed secret communications, and worked tirelessly to unite the Bolsheviks. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks launched the October Revolution, seizing control of the government. It was a bold and dramatic move, and it worked. The Bolsheviks were now in power. Stalin's loyalty and hard work during the revolution earned him Lenin's respect. Lenin gave Stalin a seat on the Politburo, the small group of leaders who made all the major decisions for the party. This was a turning point for Stalin. He was no longer just a revolutionary. He was now part of the ruling elite. But Stalin didn't stop there. He began to build his own power within the party. He took on the role of general secretary, a position that allowed him to control who joined the Bolsheviks and who didn't. At first, this seemed like a simple administrative job, but Stalin used it wisely. He built alliances, rewarded loyal supporters, and quietly removed those who opposed him. Step by step, he was consolidating his power. The revolution had changed Russia forever, but the future was uncertain. The country was divided, with many people still loyal to the Tsar or other political groups. A civil war erupted, and the Bolsheviks faced enemies from all sides. Stalin played a key role during this time, organizing supplies and strategies to support the Red Army. His actions helped the Bolsheviks win the war and secure their control over Russia. By the early 1920s, Stalin had risen to the top ranks of the party. He was no longer the young poet or the fugitive revolutionary. He was now a leader, a man respected and feared by his comrades. His journey from a poor boy in Georgia to one of the most powerful figures in the Bolshevik Party was nearly complete. But Stalin's rise wasn't just about his own ambition. It was about the dream he shared with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, a dream of a new, equal society, a society where workers ruled, not kings or capitalists. It was this dream that had driven Stalin through years of hardship and struggle. Still, the question remained: how far would Stalin go to achieve his goals? And what kind of leader would he become? The name Stalin now carried weight. It was no longer just a name, it was a promise of strength, determination, and an unyielding will. The man of steel was ready to take his place in history. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on WooEnglish. Remember, this content is specially made for WooEnglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of WooEnglish's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6, The Fall of an Empire. The year was 1917, and Russia was in chaos. For centuries, the czars had ruled with absolute power. They lived in palaces while the people struggled to survive. But now, the people had had enough. Hunger, war, and inequality pushed them to the edge. The streets of Russia's cities were filled with protests and strikes. Factories stopped working. Soldiers refused to fight. Revolution was in the air. In February, the unthinkable happened. Tsar Nicholas II, the ruler of Russia, abdicated his throne. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, was finished. A new government was formed. It was called the Provisional Government. But it was weak and unsure of itself. The people wanted change, and they wanted it quickly. But the provisional government couldn't deliver. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, saw their chance. They promised peace, bread, and land. 3 things the people desperately wanted. Their message spread like wildfire. Workers, peasants, and soldiers began to join their cause. And among the Bolsheviks, one man was rising steadily: Joseph Stalin. Stalin's role in 1917 wasn't as visible as Lenin's or Trotsky's. He wasn't giving fiery speeches to massive crowds or leading dramatic battles. Instead, Stalin worked behind the scenes. He was a strategist, organizing meetings and coordinating plans. His calm, quiet efficiency made him indispensable to the Bolshevik Party. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks made their move. They staged the October Revolution, seizing power from the provisional government. It was a daring and decisive moment. The Bolsheviks took over government buildings, the telephone exchange, and even the Winter Palace in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. By morning, they were in control. Stalin was there during these crucial days. He worked closely with Lenin, ensuring that every part of the plan went smoothly. While others focused on inspiring the masses, Stalin focused on the details. His work wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. Without it, the revolution might have failed. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks were in charge, but their troubles were far from over. Russia was in turmoil. Many people didn't support the Bolsheviks. Some wanted the Tsar back. Others wanted a more moderate government. Civil war broke out, and the country descended into violence. The Bolsheviks, now called the Communists, faced enemies on all sides. These enemies were known as the Whites, a mix of monarchists, foreign armies, and other anti-Bolshevik forces. The Reds, the Bolshevik forces, had to fight hard to keep their new government alive. Stalin played a key role during this time. He was sent to areas where the fighting was fiercest. One of his first missions was in Tsaritsyn, a city on the Volga River. The situation there was desperate. The Whites were advancing, and food supplies were running out. Stalin acted quickly. He reorganized the defenses, secured food shipments, and inspired the soldiers. His tough decisions helped turn the tide. Later, Tsaritsyn would be renamed Stalingrad in his honor. But Stalin's methods weren't always popular. He was known for being ruthless. If someone disobeyed orders or showed weakness, Stalin didn't hesitate to punish them. Some thought he went too far. Others admired his determination. Either way, it was clear. Stalin got results. Meanwhile, Lenin continued to trust Stalin. He gave him more responsibilities, including managing supplies and organizing key parts of the Red Army. Stalin's influence within the party grew. He was becoming one of Lenin's most important allies. By 1920, the Russian Civil War was coming to an end. The Reds had defeated the Whites, and the Bolsheviks were firmly in power. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Millions of people had died from war, hunger, and disease. The country was shattered. Cities were in ruins. Farms were abandoned. The people were exhausted. Now, the Bolsheviks faced a new challenge: rebuilding Russia. They renamed the country the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, or simply the Soviet Union. It was the world's first communist state. The Bolsheviks promised to create a society where everyone was equal. No more kings or landlords. The workers and peasants would rule. But building this new world wasn't easy. The Soviet Union was filled with problems. Factories weren't producing enough. Farms weren't growing enough food. People were still starving. Lenin and the Bolshevik leaders debated how to fix these problems. Stalin was often at the center of these discussions. In 1922, Lenin created a new position within the party: General Secretary. He chose Stalin for the role. At first, it seemed like an administrative job, organizing meetings, keeping records, and managing party members. But Stalin saw its potential. As General Secretary, he could appoint people to important positions. He used this power to build a network of loyal supporters. Lenin began to notice Stalin's growing influence. At times, Lenin worried that Stalin was becoming too powerful. In one letter, Lenin even warned the party about Stalin's ambition. But Lenin's health was failing. In 1924, Lenin died, leaving the Soviet Union without its founding leader. With Lenin gone, a power struggle began within the Bolshevik Party. Stalin was no longer just the quiet man in the background. He was a major player, ready to take center stage. His rivals underestimated him, thinking he was too simple, too plain to lead. But Stalin proved them wrong. He used his position as General Secretary to outmaneuver his enemies. He built alliances, made deals, and slowly pushed his rivals out of power. By the late 1920s, Stalin was the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Tsar's empire had opened the door to a new world. A world shaped by revolution, struggle, and change. And in this new world, Stalin was rising higher than anyone could have imagined. But the journey wasn't over. Stalin had achieved power, but now he had to hold on to it. How would he rule this vast and broken country? And what kind of leader would he become? The boy from Georgia, the revolutionary from Siberia, had climbed to the top. The man of steel was ready to shape the future of the Soviet Union and the world. Chapter 7. Building the Soviet Machine. In the late 1920s, Stalin stood at the top of the Soviet Union. But the country he ruled was broken. Farms were failing, factories were outdated, the people were poor and hungry. Stalin believed the Soviet Union needed a complete transformation. It was time to build a new kind of country, a powerful, industrialized nation. And Stalin was determined to make it happen. But his vision came with a price. Stalin's plan was bold and ambitious. He called it the 5-year plan. Factories would be built, farms would be reorganized, and resources would be directed toward industrial growth. The Soviet Union would no longer rely on other countries for goods. It would stand strong on its own. Stalin wanted the world to see the Soviet Union as a modern, powerful state. The focus of the plan was industry. Stalin believed that factories were the key to success. He wanted to produce more steel, coal, and machinery than ever before. Massive factories rose from the ground, their smokestacks reaching into the sky. Workers were told to meet high production targets. If they failed, there would be consequences. But if they succeeded, Stalin promised a brighter future. Millions of people moved from the countryside to cities to work in these new factories. The work was hard and dangerous. Many people worked long hours in terrible conditions. But Stalin didn't allow complaints. He called these workers heroes of socialism. Propaganda posters showed smiling workers, strong and proud, helping to build a better country. While factories grew, Stalin also wanted to change farming. He believed that traditional farming methods were old-fashioned and inefficient. He introduced a system called collectivization. Under this system, farmers had to give up their land and animals. Instead, they worked on large, state-controlled farms called collectives. Stalin believed this would produce more food for the country. But many farmers didn't want to give up their land. They had worked hard to build their farms. They saw collectivization as theft. Some resisted by burning their crops or killing their animals. Stalin called these people kulaks and said they were enemies of the state. The government responded with force. Soldiers and police were sent to villages to take land and punish anyone who resisted. Entire families were arrested and sent to Siberia. The process was brutal. Millions of farmers lost everything. Collectivization had another terrible effect. In some regions, especially in Ukraine, it led to a famine. Farmers were forced to give their grain to the state, leaving them with nothing to eat. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of people starved to death. This tragedy is known as the Holodomor. People begged for food, but none came. The suffering was unimaginable. Stalin's government denied the famine. Official reports claimed that everything was fine. Propaganda films showed happy farmers working together. But the truth was very different. The fields were empty, the villages were silent, and the people were dying. Despite these horrors, Stalin pressed forward. He believed the sacrifices were necessary. He called it the cost of progress. In his mind, the future of the Soviet Union depended on rapid change. Without it, he feared the country would be too weak to survive in a hostile world. And in some ways, Stalin's plans worked. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Union's factories were producing more than ever before. Cities like Moscow and Leningrad became centers of industry. The Soviet Union was becoming a modern power. But the cost of this progress was staggering. Millions had suffered and died to make it possible. Stalin ruled with fear. Anyone who opposed his plans risked being labeled an enemy of the state. This fear spread through every part of Soviet life. People were afraid to speak their minds. Even Stalin's closest allies were not safe. In the mid-1930s, Stalin launched what is now known as the Great Purge. He believed there were enemies everywhere, within the government, the military, and even the Communist Party itself. Stalin demanded loyalty, and anyone he suspected of betrayal was arrested. Many were executed. Others were sent to gulags, harsh labor camps in Siberia. The Great Purge created a climate of terror. People lived in constant fear of being accused of crimes they didn't commit. Families were torn apart. Friends turned against each other. Stalin's power grew stronger, but at a terrible cost. Despite the suffering, Stalin's vision transformed the Soviet Union. The 5-year plans continued, each one pushing for more growth. The country built dams, railroads, and power plants. New cities appeared where there had once been empty land. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union was one of the world's leading industrial powers. Stalin was proud of these achievements. He spoke of the Soviet Union as a model for the rest of the world. He believed his leadership had made it possible. Propaganda celebrated Stalin as a hero. Statues of him were built in cities and towns. His face appeared on posters, coins, and even school books. He became larger than life, an almost godlike figure. But not everyone saw him this way. Many people remembered the famine, the purges, and the fear. They saw the cost of Stalin's success, and they wondered, was it worth it? For Stalin, the answer was clear. He believed he had saved the Soviet Union. He believed his methods were the only way to achieve progress, and he was willing to do whatever it took to keep his country strong. By the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union was ready for its next chapter. The factories were running, the farms were reorganized, and Stalin's power was absolute. But the world was changing. A storm was coming. And Stalin would soon face the greatest challenge of his life: war. Chapter 8. Enemies Everywhere. By the 1930s, Joseph Stalin was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. Factories roared, cities grew, and the Red Army was stronger than ever. But Stalin wasn't satisfied. He wanted total control over the government, the military, and even people's thoughts. To achieve this, he trusted no one. Not his friends, not his allies, not even the people closest to him. Stalin believed there were enemies everywhere. His fear began to grow after the death of Sergei Kirov, a high-ranking Communist Party leader in 1934. Kirov was young, popular, and well-loved by many in the party. He was shot by an assassin in his office. Officially, the government blamed a lone gunman, but many historians believe Stalin may have been involved. Why? Because Kirov was seen as a potential rival. His death gave Stalin the excuse he needed to launch a massive campaign against his so-called enemies. Stalin called it the fight against counter-revolutionaries and traitors, but in truth, it was a campaign of terror, now known as the Great Purge. The first targets were Stalin's political rivals, men like Leon Trotsky, who had once been Stalin's ally, now became his greatest enemy. Trotsky had been one of the most important leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution. He was brilliant and charismatic. Many in the party admired him. But Stalin saw him as a threat. Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union in 1929, but even far away, he wasn't safe. Stalin sent assassins to hunt him down. In 1940, one of them succeeded. Trotsky was killed in Mexico, struck with an ice axe. Stalin had eliminated another enemy. But Stalin's purge didn't stop with Trotsky. It grew wider, darker, and more terrifying. Stalin turned his attention to the Communist Party itself. He believed that many party members were secretly working against him. He ordered mass arrests. Leaders who had once been his friends were taken away in the middle of the night. They were accused of plotting to overthrow him. Many of these accusations were false, but Stalin didn't care. The arrested leaders were forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit. These confessions were often obtained through torture. In public trials, they admitted to being spies or traitors. The trials were broadcast across the Soviet Union. The people were told that Stalin was saving them from these enemies. After the trials, most of the accused were executed. One by one, Stalin eliminated anyone who could challenge him. The purge spread beyond the Communist Party. Stalin targeted the military next. He feared that the army might rise against him. In 1937, he ordered the arrest of many top generals. These men had fought in the Civil War and had been loyal to the Bolshevik cause. But loyalty didn't matter to Stalin. He thought they might betray him someday, so he decided to act first. The arrests weakened the Red Army at a critical time. By the end of the purge, thousands of officers had been removed. The Soviet Union was left vulnerable, just as tensions in Europe were rising. But Stalin didn't stop. He believed his own survival depended on eliminating every possible threat. Ordinary people were not spared. Farmers, factory workers, teachers, writers, no one was safe. People lived in constant fear. Neighbors spied on each other. A single accusation could lead to arrest. The secret police, known as the NKVD, worked day and night. They listened, watched, and reported. The sound of boots on the stairs at night became a symbol of terror. It often meant someone was being taken away, never to return. Prisons and labor camps, known as gulags, filled with millions of people. Conditions in these camps were brutal. Prisoners worked long hours in freezing temperatures with little food or rest. Many died from exhaustion, disease, or starvation. Families were torn apart. Friends disappeared without explanation. Stalin's paranoia grew worse over time. He trusted no one. Even his closest allies had to constantly prove their loyalty. People around him learned to be silent, careful with their words, and always ready to agree with him. One wrong step could mean death. But why was Stalin so afraid? Some believe it was because of his childhood. He had grown up poor and scarred by abuse. Others think it was his early years as a revolutionary, when betrayal was common and survival meant trusting no one. Whatever the reason, Stalin's fear shaped his rule. It turned him into a leader who saw enemies everywhere, even when there were none. Despite the suffering caused by the Great Purge, Stalin's power grew. He controlled the government, the military, and the Communist Party. The people feared him, but they also respected him, or at least they pretended to. Propaganda portrayed Stalin as a wise and caring leader. Statues and posters showed him as a father figure, watching over his people. But beneath the surface, the country was wounded. Millions of lives had been destroyed. Families had been broken. And the people who had once believed in the revolution began to wonder if this was what they had fought for. The Great Purge officially ended in the late 1930s, but its effects lasted for years. The Soviet Union was forever changed. Stalin had removed all opposition, but at a terrible cost. Trust had been replaced with fear. The people obeyed, not because they believed, but because they were afraid of what might happen if they didn't. Stalin, however, saw the purge as a success. He believed he had protected the revolution and secured his place as its leader. He saw himself as the guardian of the Soviet Union, ready to defend it against any threat, real or imagined. But the world outside the Soviet Union was changing. A new danger was rising in Europe, and soon Stalin would face a challenge far greater than any he had ever known. Chapter 9. The War of Survival. It was June 22nd, 1941, when the unthinkable happened. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. This attack, called Operation Barbarossa, was the largest military operation in history. Millions of German soldiers stormed across the Soviet border, aiming to destroy Stalin's empire. Stalin was shocked. Just 2 years earlier, he had signed a pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This agreement promised that neither country would attack the other. Stalin believed it had bought him time to prepare. But now, Hitler had broken that promise. The Nazis were coming, and the Soviet Union was not ready. The first weeks of the war were a disaster. The German army advanced quickly, using tanks, planes, and well-coordinated attacks. Soviet forces were caught off guard. Entire divisions were destroyed. Cities like Minsk and Kyiv fell into enemy hands. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. The Nazi invasion was brutal. Civilians were murdered, villages were burned, and fear spread across the land. Stalin disappeared for several days after the invasion began. Some say he was paralyzed by shock. Others believe he was planning his next move. When he finally addressed the Soviet people, his words were clear and powerful. "Comrades, the enemy is at our gates. We must fight for our survival." Stalin's leadership during the war was marked by both strength and mistakes. At first, he refused to allow his generals to retreat, even when it was clear they were losing. This decision cost countless lives. But over time, Stalin began to listen to his military advisors. He realized that survival required strategy, not just stubbornness. The Soviet people were called to defend their homeland. Men and women joined the army. Factories were moved deep into the country, away from the advancing Germans. Workers produced weapons, tanks, and ammunition day and night. Farmers struggled to feed the soldiers and the people. Everyone was expected to contribute. Propaganda played a key role in rallying the population. Posters showed strong Soviet soldiers defeating the Nazis. Songs and speeches inspired people to fight. Stalin became the symbol of resistance. He was no longer just a leader. He was the voice of survival. One of the most critical battles of the war was the Battle of Stalingrad, fought between 1942 and 1943. This city, named after Stalin, became the focus of Hitler's campaign. The Nazis wanted to capture it, not just for its strategic importance, but to humiliate Stalin. The battle was brutal. German bombs reduced much of the city to rubble. Soviet soldiers and civilians fought street by street, house by house. Stalin issued a famous order: not one step back. Retreat was forbidden. Anyone who tried to abandon their post risked being shot. The Red Army, along with local civilians, fought with incredible bravery. After months of fighting, the Soviet forces surrounded the German army in Stalingrad. The Nazis, cold and starving, were forced to surrender. This was a turning point in the war. For the first time, Hitler's army had been defeated on a large scale. The victory at Stalingrad gave the Soviet people hope. It showed that the Nazis were not invincible. Stalin's leadership during the battle strengthened his image. Propaganda celebrated him as the hero who had saved the city. But the cost of victory was enormous. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died during the battle. The city was left in ruins. After Stalingrad, the Red Army began to push the Germans back. In battle after battle, the Soviet forces regained lost territory. By 1944, they were advancing into Eastern Europe. Stalin's generals, including Georgy Zhukov, played a major role in these victories. But Stalin always made sure to take the credit. He wanted the world to see him as the architect of the Soviet Union's success. As the Red Army marched west, they discovered the horrors of Nazi occupation. Entire villages had been wiped out. Millions of Jews, along with other groups, had been murdered in concentration camps. The scale of the atrocities shocked even Stalin. He vowed to punish those responsible. In May 1945, the war in Europe finally ended. The Red Army captured Berlin, forcing Hitler's government to surrender. The Soviet Union had played a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany. Stalin stood triumphant. But the cost of victory was staggering. More than 27 million Soviet citizens had died during the war. Entire cities had been destroyed. The country was broken, but it had survived. Stalin's leadership during the war was complex. On one hand, he had united the Soviet people in their fight against a common enemy. His determination and ability to mobilize resources were key to victory. On the other hand, his decisions often came at a terrible cost. His refusal to allow retreats, his mistrust of his generals, and his harsh punishments led to unnecessary suffering. Despite this, Stalin emerged from the war stronger than ever. His image as a leader was cemented. The Soviet people saw him as the man who had saved their country. Propaganda praised him as a hero, the father of the nation. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The fear, the purges, and the losses had left deep scars on the Soviet Union. After the war, Stalin's focus shifted. The Soviet Union had survived, but now it faced new challenges. The world was entering a new era, one defined by tensions between the Soviet Union and its former allies. The Cold War was just beginning, and Stalin, as always, was ready to face the next battle. Chapter 10: Victory and the Price of Power. The year was 1945, and the war in Europe was over. The streets of Moscow erupted in celebration. People cheered, sang songs, and waved red flags. The Red Army had defeated Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union stood victorious. At the center of it all was Joseph Stalin, hailed as the hero who had saved the nation. For Stalin, this was his greatest triumph. The Soviet Union had proven its strength. It had endured the largest invasion in history, fought back against a powerful enemy, and emerged victorious. Stalin's image was everywhere, on posters, in newspapers, and in the hearts of the people. But beneath the celebrations, the country was deeply wounded. The war had left the Soviet Union in ruins. Entire cities were destroyed. Villages had been burned to the ground. Millions of homes were gone, leaving families with nowhere to live. Factories had been bombed, and farmlands were left barren. Most heartbreaking of all, more than 27 million Soviet citizens had died. Every family had lost someone. Stalin called the Soviet Union's victory a miracle. But for the people, it felt like a miracle they had barely survived. They had fought with incredible bravery, sacrificing everything for their country. And now they faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. Stalin promised to rebuild the Soviet Union. He declared that the country would rise stronger than ever. Factories began working again. producing steel, coal, and machinery. Construction crews worked day and night to rebuild cities. In Stalingrad, where the fighting had been fiercest, new buildings rose from the rubble. Stalin said this was proof of the Soviet people's strength. But the rebuilding effort was harsh. Workers were given impossible targets to meet. Those who failed were punished. Food was still scarce, and many people went hungry. Farmers struggled to grow enough to feed the nation. Stalin demanded that they send their grain to the cities, even if it meant their own families went without. Once again, the people bore the heavy burden of Stalin's plans. As the Soviet Union rebuilt, Stalin's focus shifted to the world stage. He wanted the Soviet Union to be seen as a global superpower. During the war, the Allies, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain had worked together to defeat Nazi Germany. But now, their alliance was crumbling. The United States and Britain viewed Stalin with suspicion. They worried about his growing influence in Eastern Europe. Stalin, in turn, distrusted them. He believed they wanted to weaken the Soviet Union. This tension marked the beginning of the Cold War, a long period of rivalry between the Soviet Union and the West. Stalin was determined to protect the Soviet Union's interests. He set up communist governments in countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. These countries became part of the Eastern Bloc, a group of states under Soviet influence. Stalin believed this would create a buffer zone, protecting the Soviet Union from future attacks. But to the West, it looked like Stalin was trying to expand his empire. Inside the Soviet Union, Stalin's control grew even tighter. He continued to rule through fear. The NKVD, his secret police, remained active. People who spoke out against the government were arrested and sent to labor camps. Even those who had fought bravely in the war were not safe. Stalin suspected some of his generals of disloyalty. He removed them from power, just as he had done during the Great Purge. Propaganda continued to play a key role in Stalin's rule. Schools taught children that Stalin was the father of the nation, the man who had led them to victory. Statues of him stood in every major city. His image was larger than life. But behind the propaganda, many people lived in fear. They knew how dangerous it was to criticize the government, or Stalin himself. Stalin's decisions after the war also created new challenges. He pushed for rapid industrialization, just as he had before the war. Factories and cities grew, but the countryside suffered. Farmers were still struggling under the system of collectivization, where land and resources were controlled by the state. Famine loomed in some areas, and the gap between city workers and rural farmers widened. Life for ordinary people remained hard. Food, clothing, and housing were in short supply. People stood in long lines for basic goods. The war had ended, but the struggle for survival continued. Stalin urged the people to keep working for the future, promising that their sacrifices would lead to a better life. Many believed him, but others began to question his methods. Internationally, Stalin's reputation was complex. To some, he was a hero, the leader who had stood firm against Hitler and helped save Europe from fascism. To others, he was a dictator who ruled through fear and violence. In the West, stories of the Great Purge and the gulags painted Stalin as a dangerous and untrustworthy figure. The Cold War only deepened these divisions. In 1949, Stalin achieved another major victory. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear bomb, becoming the second country in the world to possess such a weapon. This marked a new chapter in the Cold War, as the Soviet Union and the United States entered an arms race. Stalin celebrated this achievement, seeing it as proof of the Soviet Union's strength. But it also brought new dangers, as the world faced the threat of nuclear war. By the early 1950s, Stalin's health was beginning to fail. He had ruled the Soviet Union for decades, and his legacy was already shaping history. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union had transformed from a struggling agrarian society into a global superpower. But the cost of this transformation was immense. Millions had died under Stalin's rule, through famine, purges, and war. Millions more had suffered in the gulags or lived in fear of arrest. The Soviet Union had achieved great power, but at a terrible price. Stalin's choices had shaped the country, for better and for worse. As Stalin's life neared its end, he remained a figure of immense power. He had led his country through one of history's darkest periods and emerged victorious. But the question remained, was the victory worth the suffering? The Soviet people had paid a heavy price for Stalin's vision of progress, and the world would continue to grapple with his legacy for years to come. Chapter 11. The Shadow of the Iron Curtain. By the late 1940s, the world had changed. The great alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was gone. Instead of friendship, there was suspicion and rivalry. The Cold War had begun, and at its heart stood two giants: the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, and the United States. Both nations had different visions for the future. Both wanted to shape the world in their image. Stalin believed in communism, a system where the government controlled everything, and wealth was shared equally. The United States championed capitalism, where businesses were free and people could own property. These ideas were opposites, and neither side trusted the other. The world was dividing into two camps, and Stalin was determined to lead one of them. In 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a famous speech. He said an iron curtain had fallen across Europe. This curtain was not made of metal. It was a symbol for the divide between the communist East and the capitalist West. Stalin took this as a challenge. He believed the Soviet Union needed to protect itself from the West, especially from the United States. Stalin began to tighten his control over the Eastern Bloc, countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany that had fallen under Soviet influence after World War II. Communist governments were installed in these nations, and they followed Moscow's orders. Any opposition was crushed. Secret police arrested those who spoke out against the Soviet Union. The people lived in fear, knowing that Stalin's shadow reached far and wide. At the same time, Stalin pushed for the Soviet Union to grow stronger. He demanded rapid industrialization, focusing on weapons and military power. Factories worked day and night, producing tanks, planes, and missiles. The goal was clear. The Soviet Union must be ready for war at any moment. Stalin believed this was the only way to protect his country from its enemies. One of Stalin's proudest achievements was the development of the atomic bomb. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear weapon. This shocked the world. Until then, the United States had been the only country with nuclear power. Now, the balance of power had shifted. Stalin celebrated this success, calling it proof of the Soviet Union's strength. But it also marked the start of a dangerous arms race. Both sides began building more and more nuclear weapons, each trying to outdo the other. The Cold War wasn't fought with armies on battlefields. Instead, it was a war of ideas, spies, and influence. Stalin wanted to spread communism around the world. He supported revolutions in places like China, where Mao Zedong established a communist government in 1949. Meanwhile, the United States tried to stop communism from spreading, offering money and aid to countries that resisted Soviet influence. Tensions reached a breaking point in 1948 during the Berlin blockade. Berlin, the capital of Germany, was divided into East and West after the war. The West was controlled by the Allies, and the East was under Soviet control. Stalin wanted to force the Allies out of Berlin. He blocked all roads and railways into the city, cutting off food and supplies to the West. The people of West Berlin faced starvation, but the Allies responded with the Berlin airlift. Planes flew over the city, dropping food and supplies. Day after day, the airlift continued, and Stalin's blockade failed. It was a humiliating moment for Stalin. But it also made him more determined to tighten his grip on Eastern Europe. Inside the Soviet Union, Stalin's rule became even harsher. The secret police continued to monitor everyone. Writers, artists, and intellectuals had to follow strict rules. Their work had to praise communism and Stalin. Any sign of dissent was punished. People were afraid to speak openly, even in their own homes. Stalin's paranoia grew. He believed that enemies were everywhere, even within the Communist Party. In the late 1940s, he launched new purges, targeting people he thought might betray him. High-ranking officials were arrested, tortured, and executed. Stalin didn't trust anyone, not even his closest allies. As the Cold War deepened, the Soviet people felt the strain. Resources were poured into the military, leaving little for everyday life. Housing was scarce, and food was rationed. People worked long hours in factories, but they still struggled to make ends meet. Propaganda told them that their sacrifices were necessary to protect the country. But many began to wonder, was Stalin's vision worth the suffering? Meanwhile, Stalin's health was failing. He had ruled with an iron grip for decades, but the weight of his power was taking its toll. By the early 1950s, he was often ill, yet he refused to let go of control. He believed that only he could defend the Soviet Union from its enemies. In 1952, Stalin held a grand meeting of the Communist Party. He spoke about the future, calling for more progress and greater unity. But behind the scenes, he was planning another purge. He believed that some members of the party were plotting against him. Many feared that Stalin's paranoia would lead to another wave of terror. But Stalin's plans were cut short. In March 1953, he suffered a stroke. For hours he lay on the floor of his room, unable to call for help. When his guards finally found him, it was too late. Stalin died a few days later, leaving behind a complex and controversial legacy. The shadow of the Iron Curtain stretched far beyond Stalin's life. The Cold War continued for decades, shaping the world in ways no one could have imagined. Stalin had transformed the Soviet Union into a superpower, but his methods left deep scars. Fear, suffering, and mistrust became a part of daily life under his rule. Even today, people debate Stalin's legacy. Was he a hero who defended his country? Or a tyrant who ruled through fear? The answer may lie somewhere in between, but one thing is clear. Stalin's vision came at a great cost, and its effects are still felt today. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Stalin. Joseph Stalin died on March 5, 1953, at the age of 74. His death marked the end of an era, but his shadow did not disappear. Instead, it stretched across history, shaping the world he left behind. Stalin's name remains one of the most famous and most debated in the 20th century. Who was Stalin? Was he a hero who built a strong Soviet Union? Or was he a villain who ruled with fear and violence? The truth, as always, is complicated. Stalin was born in poverty, a boy from a small town in Georgia. His journey to power was remarkable. He rose from obscurity to become the leader of one of the world's largest nations. Along the way, he transformed the Soviet Union into a global superpower. Under his rule, the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany, sent the first satellite into space, and challenged the United States in the Cold War. These were achievements that many in the Soviet Union admired. But Stalin's leadership came at a great cost. His policies caused immense suffering. Millions died in famines caused by collectivization. Millions more were executed or sent to gulags during the Great Purge. Even in wartime, Stalin's harsh decisions often led to unnecessary losses. The Soviet people endured incredible hardships under his rule. When Stalin died, the Soviet Union was a country of contradictions. It was powerful, yet scarred. It had achieved great things, but at a terrible price. The people mourned his death, but they also feared him. Crowds gathered to pay their respects, and his body was displayed in Moscow. For many, it felt like the end of a chapter. But Stalin's legacy didn't end with his death. In the years that followed, leaders in the Soviet Union began to question his methods. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, gave a shocking speech. He condemned Stalin's rule, calling it a time of terror and mistakes. Khrushchev's speech marked the beginning of de-Stalinization, an effort to distance the Soviet Union from Stalin's policies. Statues of Stalin were taken down. His name was removed from cities and streets. The Soviet government began to reveal the horrors of his purges and the suffering caused by his decisions. For many, this was the first time they learned the full extent of Stalin's actions. Some were shocked. Others were angry. The man they had once called a hero was now seen in a different light. But not everyone agreed with Khrushchev's criticism. Some people in the Soviet Union still admired Stalin. They remembered him as the leader who had defeated Hitler, the man who had made the Soviet Union strong. For these people, Stalin's harsh methods were justified by the results. They believed that the sacrifices he demanded were necessary for progress. This divide in opinion continues today. In modern Russia, some see Stalin as a symbol of strength and order. Others see him as a symbol of oppression and cruelty. His legacy is as complex as the man himself. Beyond Russia, Stalin's impact was felt around the world. His leadership shaped the course of the 20th century. The Soviet Union became a superpower, challenging the United States in a global struggle for influence. This rivalry defined the Cold War, affecting countries on every continent. Stalin's actions helped create a world divided by ideology, a world of alliances and enemies, of hope and fear. Even after the Cold War ended, Stalin's shadow remained. Historians continued to study his life, debating his motives and his impact. Writers and filmmakers told stories about him, exploring his rise to power, his policies, and the fear he inspired. His name became a symbol of ambition and its dangers. Stalin's story is not just about one man. It is about power. Power that can build and destroy. Power that can inspire loyalty and fear. Stalin's life shows us how power can shape a nation for better or worse. His decisions changed the lives of millions, leaving a legacy that is still felt today. For some, Stalin represents the strength of the Soviet Union, its ability to endure and succeed. For others, he represents the suffering of the Soviet people, the price they paid for his ambition. These two views will likely continue to shape how Stalin is remembered. In the end, the legacy of Joseph Stalin is a warning. It reminds us of the cost of unchecked power and the dangers of fear and mistrust. But it also reminds us of the resilience of people who endure even in the darkest times. The Soviet Union survived Stalin's rule, and its people carried on, rebuilding their lives and their nation. Today, Stalin's name continues to spark debate. His life raises questions about leadership, responsibility, and the price of ambition. Was he a hero, a villain, or something in between? The answer depends on who you ask. But one thing is certain. The story of Stalin is not just a story of the past. It is a story that still speaks to us today.